Well, welcome to the Free Mind Podcast, where we're seeking the true, the good, the beautiful, the timely, the eternal, the resplendent, the interesting. I'm your new host, Joseph Porter, taking over from Matt Burgess, who's done a wonderful job. This is the podcast of the Benson Center for the Study of Western Civilization at the University of Colorado, and really excited for this opportunity. And with me today are two wonderful scholars and friends, Paul Diduch, who is the faculty director of the Engineering Leadership Program here at the University of Colorado and also a faculty fellow in the Benson Center. And Matthew Young. Matt is an assistant professor of political science and public policy at Elon University. And our topic today is the parable of the Good Samaritan in American politics. We'll be taking this parable as a jumping point and then see where the conversation takes us. And a little bit of background that might be helpful is that in an interview a few weeks ago, Vice President JD Vance said there's a Christian concept that you love your family, and then you love your neighbor, and then you love your community, and then you love your fellow citizens in your own country. And then after that, prioritize the rest of the world. And perhaps surprisingly, he got some pushback on this. And probably the main proof text cited in opposition to the point he was making is the parable of the Good Samaritan. I thought it's a short parable. I thought it'd be worth reading through the parable quickly, saying a couple things, and then we will get this show on the road. So the parable is in Luke 10, verses 25 through 37. I'll be reading out of the ESV. And behold, a lawyer stood up to put him, that is Jesus, to the test, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" And he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You've answered correctly. Do this and you will live." But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back." Which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? He said, "The one who showed him mercy." And Jesus said to him, "You go and do likewise." Now, there's a lot we could say about this parable, and happy to talk about different angles. But one possibly expected take is that while there's a challenging and beautiful, I think, message here, I'm not sure there's anything that fundamentally contradicts the point that Vance is trying to make. We can talk more about that, of course. And maybe a slightly hotter take, uh, including this parable. I think there's very, very little in the Bible that directly applies to contemporary politics. I think there's stuff that indirectly applies in lots of ways, but we have to think about what the steps are to kind of bridge the gap. Because when the New Testament in particular is being written, what Christianity is, it's a very tiny uh, religious community with no hope or expectation of immediate political power in the Roman Empire. So the question, what should we do? with political power, or even the question, should we try to obtain political power? I'm not really sure those kinds of questions are on anyone's radar. And yet, of course, from the very beginning of the American experiment, people have been using the Bible, talking about the Bible to justify and expound on different political visions. So I'm curious, of course, to hear your thoughts. I'll shut up for the time being.
Sure. Just one thought that uh, emerges to me, and this is Matt Young speaking here. One thought that emerges immediately is, Vance is referencing this idea of the ordo amoris, like the properly ordered loves, and suggesting that there's a certain ranking or hierarchy of the loves in our lives. And so you'd say, and I think most people would agree with this, like it would be wrong to neglect my children. I have young children. It would be wrong to neglect my children in order that I could go provide the things that I am neglecting to my children to someone else, or that it would be wrong to prioritize those who are far more distant from me over the people who I have closer sort of bonds of obligation to in the family, in my local community, etc. But one thing that just struck me immediately when I heard Vance make this remark was that it sounded much more similar to like what Edmund Burke says, where he describes the little platoon and how he says it's affection for our little platoon that's the proper germ or the of public affection. And Burke, sort of continues on. He says it's the first link in the series by which we proceed towards a love of our country and to mankind. And so um, Burke has this maybe related idea, but I'm curious what you two think about this, Paul and Joe. Uh, just when I first heard it, I thought that doesn't sound like St. Augustine the way Vance said it. It sounds like Edmund Burke.
It's funny you say that, and is because when I heard what Vance said, I thought it sounded like Cicero. And if you read On Duties or De Officiis, you'll see Cicero, I think, saying much more explicitly something along the lines of what Vance has in mind than any biblical text I'm aware of. Which again doesn't mean that the kind of fundamental principles that Vance has in mind, that there aren't resources within the Bible that can be marshaled to justify his point. I think that's probably true, but it's certainly not laid out as explicitly as it might be in Cicero or Burke, to your point, let alone Augustine or Aquinas.
Do either of you guys know why Vance was prompted to make these remarks? I didn't look at the issued text. What prompted him? Why did he say this?
Well, the broader context, I think, is questions about immigration and obviously the cuts to U.S. aid funding. That's, I think, the stuff that's in the background.
I
And
see.
Vance's point is we have to um, we have a responsibility to take care of our families first, our country first. Obviously, America first has been one of the slogans of the administration. And um, one thing, looking at the parable of the Good Samaritan, you can see a message for that everyone is in some sense our neighbor, and that we should be willing to be a neighbor to anyone who crosses our path. That doesn't need to contradict the point that you might have special obligations to your young children, to Matt's point, to your countrymen, One I would add, I think this is one that's most emphasized in the New Testament, is to your uh, fellow believers. So I think, for instance, the parable of the sheep and the goats is referring to care that Christians show to other Christians specifically, and the emphasis on benevolence that you see in other passages we can talk about is there's certainly a focus and a prioritization given to fellow Christians. So there are resources, 1 Timothy 5, anyone who doesn't provide for his family members, I'm paraphrasing, is worse than an unbeliever. There are resources, I think, in different points of Scripture that can support a point like the one Vance was making. But of course, one big question is, so we can say we buy that there's something like an ordo amoris for us as private citizens and individuals, that we have special obligations to our families and so on. What does that mean for the obligations and the priorities of the state?
Yeah, right. That was going to be
That's
my
Yeah.
question to you next was, do you take Vance to be pushing against the idea that something like the teaching of the Good Samaritan, that it would be a mistake to construe this as a political duty to illegal immigrants or something like this, that there's a confusion of Christian charity with extending the resources of the state. Some, you know, um, are you implying that Vance was pushing in that direction?
I think I want to start at one step earlier and ask why Vance is bringing up this idea of a hierarchy of obligations or an ordo amoris in this context, where, like Joe suggested, it might seem obvious that as an individual, I have obligations to my children first and foremost. But Vance is not speaking in this context as another dad with young children. He's speaking as, the Vice President of the United States of America. And in an interview about immigration on Fox News, where there's a conversation about various policies in the in the Trump administration, and and so he suggests that, I think, as a way of defending the sort of America First policy, that there's a hierarchy of obligations, and he gives this explanation about, prioritizing like your family first, etc. In the quote, but there's even a parallel there that isn't, I think, obvious at first, that the way obligations work for us as individuals may not have a clear parallel to the way obligations work for political officials who are elected to represent the interests of a nation, etc. And then that sort of leads into the question you just brought up, Paul, about how Vance might respond to someone else bringing up the story of the or the parable of the Good Samaritan. That kind of similarly, there's maybe a disjunct between what seems to be the obvious teaching for individuals versus the teaching, or the application as a matter of public policy.
And there's some interesting questions too, I think, in terms of how we conceptualize the relationship among these different obligations, potential conflicts that might arise, um, and how much weighting of a prioritization there should be for, even if we buy that there's something like the ordo amoris that should be applied to uh, the federal government in the United States. So what does that mean? Zero foreign aid? Does it mean just 1% foreign aid? And as a lot of people like to point out, a lot of people vastly overestimate the percent of the federal budget that's devoted to foreign aid. There's a question, well, what does it mean? We can talk about the effectiveness of foreign aid. I think there's an interesting case to be made that if you're worried about the institutional integrity uh, of the United States and some of the kind of social engineering and experimentation we've seen over the past few decades is not actually loving anyone in the long run, because you're going to cook the goose that's laying the golden egg. So that's a whole nother can of worms that we could get into. But there's this interesting question. There's nothing in the Bible or in the first at least couple centuries of the history of Christianity in which someone is saying, here's how we translate these texts that are written for individuals and small religious groups, churches, and so on. Here's how we would extrapolate to the political context. No one is saying, so suppose the emperor of Rome becomes a Christian. What should he do then? Those questions obviously do arise later on, but not yet. And that strikes me as an interesting and important point.
So I take it that Vance thinks it's sort of obvious, maybe as a matter of common sense or of natural law, that um, you have to make decisions about what to prioritize, and that you should prioritize your family over strangers. That you should prioritize. I think the implication when he invokes this is that if you're the president of the United States, you should prioritize the citizens of the United States over sort of strangers in the geopolitical context. And so if we take that as Vance's intention, I think, applying this concept, we have to ask whether it's a matter of just positively doing good to others, or avoiding harming others, or comparing amounts of good we do to others. And something you said earlier, Joe, reminded me of in the book of Galatians, where it says that you should do good to all, especially to those who belong to the household of faith. I think that's in chapter 6. And so it's invoking this idea as a Christian, you should especially do good to others who are believers, others who belong to the church. But no, it doesn't say do good only to those who are in the household of faith. It doesn't say do good especially to those who belong to the household of faith and harm those who don't. It says do good to all, especially those who belong to the household of faith. And kind of similarly, St. Augustine in On Christian Doctrine writes, and he says, it's clear that every man is to be considered our neighbor, because we are to work no ill to any man. And so Augustine's sort of reading or gloss on the parable of the Good Samaritan is he's like, you should consider all human beings to be your neighbor. But then his explanation there is you're to consider them all your neighbor because you're not to work ill to any of them. You're not supposed to positively sort of harm any of them. But that doesn't necessarily imply, I think, that you have to give every human being the same, because they're all to be treated as your neighbors, that you have to give them all the same benefits that you give to your own children. And I think that might be at the core of some of the disagreement about this concept and its application with regards to immigration or to foreign aid, that some people interpret the Trump administration or the or these policies as either just positively withholding some sort of good you have been providing. Say, you stop sending foreign aid, or they might view it as, um, curtailing the goods you're providing. Other people interpret those policies as directly harming the the people in question. And how you interpret those policies seems to really matter for whether Vance's type of argument holds, maybe as part of the or in the Christian tradition he's appealing to.
Well, and just to add, I think that's a great point. To add to it, in the context of immigration, I think you have people who are going to look at immigration and say, "Well, this is harming the this is harming us. This is harming the natives who are supposed to be helped by the government." And another other people, the open borders libertarians I know are going to say immigration is just a win-win. So you're benefiting immigrants by letting them come, but you're benefiting the natives too. Look at the economic gains and so on. So whether we see conflicts and tensions among the more special duties and the more general duties is going to be something that's important too. There's no hint in the parable of the Good Samaritan that the Samaritan is harming or depriving his own family members by acting as he does. And of course, we don't have to concede that you're harming Americans by helping others, but these kinds of tensions are definitely, they're possible tensions, I should say. One of the things that are you know that are driving the different interpretations.
Yeah, just a couple of things. I mean, in the parable, the Samaritan does, spend down some of his resources to help the stranger or whoever. So there's some sort of sacrifice. It's meant to be noble in some sense. But I just want to go back to Vance quickly. So do you guys take it that Vance is saying that based on this, let's say, Christian, loosely speaking, Christian notion of ordered commitments or ordered attachments, ordered affection, that the state doesn't have a binding, let's say, morally binding requirement to tend to immigrants? Like, is he using a Christian notion to uh, sort of orient the state's priority? Because that's very different than doing what you suggested earlier, Joseph, which is saying it's not clear what the Bible requires of us, an agent of the government. That's different. Like, it seems like he's making a Christian argument about how to orient the state, as opposed to saying it's not clear what the Bible requires of the office of immigration or the office of the vice president or whatever.
I think you're right, Paul. I think he's making an argument about how the priorities of the state should be ordered, based on this notion of ordered commitments or ordered affections. I I don't think Vance is saying that the United States doesn't have any moral obligations to people who aren't citizens, but that the obligations to people who are U.S. citizens or who are in the United States legally are different and higher priority than obligations the United States has to people in sort of the next ring or the outer rings of relation in that sense. Does that sound right to you, Joe?
Yeah, and I mean, just to what he says, at the end, there's after that, after loving your neighbor or your country and so on, you prioritize the rest of the world. So um, we can we can talk about whether we think he's sincere, but what he's saying is at the end, there is an obligation to the rest of the world of some kind. Um, there's not zero obligation to, anyone who's not in your family or community or so on. So I took the point to be one of prioritization, and that the obligations to family and so on take precedent. There's nothing explicit in the parable of the Good Samaritan that counts against such prioritization. The fact that we should, be neighborly towards wounded uh, strangers we come across doesn't mean that we have, even higher obligations to our family members. Um,
But
so
I mean,
that's what I took.
I,
Go ahead.
I do want to speak up for maybe those critics of Vance,
Good.
who might say, yeah, but isn't part of the radicalness of Jesus's teaching the fact that he does challenge the very family oriented perspective of
Mhm.
his Jewish peers, that uh, they take the law in a very intuitive way, an intuitive way that would map very well onto what Vance is saying, and Jesus goes out of his way to provoke that understanding, right, that as part of his challenge to be spiritually perfect. So, I mean, the critics, don't. It's not like they have nothing to stand on here.
Right. Yeah, and I think there's a couple of sort of serious responses uh, that people might have to Vance's position. One is to argue that he's empirically wrong about uh, about um, sort of this implication that you can't keep your obligations to everyone at the degree that they currently are. And this goes back to what Joe said earlier. Some people are going to say, like, no, immigration's a unmitigated good across the board, and it seems like Vance has this sort of uh, zero sum, might not be quite the right word, but Vance has uh, is speaking in this position or this view that uh, right now you can't keep all of your obligations, or you can't do everything you would like to do for everyone in the entire world. And so saying, like, here's the budgetary limit of what we can do, and we have to make difficult decisions about priorities. And so people could respond and say Vance is wrong about that. He's wrong to think that immigration is a negative, or that right now it's a negative, or the like, or like you said, Paul. A critic could respond and say, the entire point of this parable is that following Christ requires you to, like, sometimes act as if you hate your family, and to do things that are sort of radically self-sacrificial and require you to bear incredible costs, and will appear to be folly to the world, or to our sort of natural ways of living. And personally, I find that maybe a little bit of a harder point to respond to, because in the parable, I don't think it's incidental that you have a Samaritan who is in this position of not being a part of the people of Israel, and a sort of outsider who is making these significant financial sacrifices and really going above and beyond in order to treat this injured person as a neighbor. And that's just worth, I think, dwelling on again, that it's not even that he stops and checks on the guy and calls the calls 911 in ancient Israel, or that he takes them into the tavern and then asks the tavern keeper to look after him, but he pays for the person's care. And really, uh, it's a pretty, if that's the standard, that's a pretty demanding standard to live up to, either as a individual or as a institution or as a nation.
Right, and is his behavior being compared to the Levite who just walks by and sort of takes a look at and doesn't do anything and
Wow, that's bad.
yeah,
Sucks to be that guy.
yeah, right.
Thoughts and prayers. No, I think. I mean, to follow up this is a good thread. I don't think that it's a very cogent criticism to say, oh, we shouldn't prioritize, family members and so on. I mean, the Galatians passage Matt mentioned and other passages I think make that clear. There's still plenty of potential radicalness. So one way we could push back is to say, okay, well, what does it mean to prioritize your kids? Does that mean that you say, well, I'm not going to give to anyone in need because my kids don't each have a yacht yet, and I need to make sure that they're taken care of. That's probably not what that Galatians 6 or the First Timothy 5 passage I mentioned have in mind. So you might think, look, the bar is, yeah, make sure that your family and in the political context, your countrymen have their basic needs well met. But then after that, that you don't need to prioritize your children's luxuries, your countrymen's luxuries over the basic needs of their, you know of strangers, foreigners, and so on. So that's one way I could imagine pushing back on the point Vance is trying to make, and just saying, look, so much of what the United States government is trying to do is not just provide for citizens' basic needs, but make sure that their 401ks are doing well, and we're going above and beyond, and that's where we need to maybe think less about the things Americans would like that aren't needs, and think more of the non-Americans who are oftentimes much less well off. Yeah, go ahead.
But there you're assuming that the parable ought to inform government policy or practice or
Well,
not.
I'm saying this is one way of, I could imagine somebody pushing back on Vance, um, because, well, I mean, one question is, he says there's this Christian concept. He could have said there's this common sense concept,
True.
or there's this natural law concept that's found in pagan writers like Cicero, and he says there's this Christian concept. And one question is, well, so how does this work? Do we pick and choose which Christian concepts are relevant to governance and which aren't, or do we say we've got to take them all into account, or do we just say, well, let's just bracket the Christian or religion stuff entirely? And I don't see out in the wild a lot of careful reflection on that, as much as I see different people saying, well, I like this verse and this idea, it fits with my politics, so we should run with that. And yeah, that other thing, oh, you're ignoring the context, oh, whatever. So there's this, I think, really deep, challenging question. How, if at all, should we translate not just the parable of the Good Samaritan, but all kinds of other parables and teachings and passages from the Bible? How should we translate them to a contemporary American context?
I was just sorry.
No, go
Uh,
ahead.
I was just thinking, Joe, that one of the things that stood out to me about this particular um, comment that Vance made and the sort of response to it was, um, that I saw lots and lots of articles, probably an opinion piece in the New York Times or like in plenty of Substack articles that wanted to debate the nitty gritties of the Ordo Amoris, or that are talking about like, oh well, if this is one Christian concept, then what about the parable of the Good Samaritan? Or that we're saying, oh, Vance has got his theology wrong, in some sense. And I feel like 10 years ago, I would have expected the conversation to be very different. Maybe even 6 or 7 years ago, that the conversation would have been like, what is Vance doing invoking a Christian concept as a justification for public policy? And maybe maybe this sort of could lead into a different thread, which is, it's like, what do we make of Vance's appeal here? Like you said, to say this is a Christian concept and using it to justify a specific public policy. Not like you said, saying, hey, look, I'm a dad. I take care of my kids first. As your vice president, I think I should take care of American citizens first. There's a way he could have invoked a similar idea without making recourse to Christianity. And like I said, my gut reaction was that I think the public conversation around these particular remarks would have looked very different just a few years ago.
Well, and if I put on my, I don't know, amateur sociologist hat and ask what's changed, I'm not sure exactly, but although there are lots of people who express concerns about, separation of church and state and so on, those concerns in practice normally amount to, well, separation of church, with politics I don't like in the state or something along those lines. Certainly not separation of all religious rhetoric or appeals to religious concepts and state. And of course, that's not what the founders had in mind. The preamble of the Constitution invokes God, as does the Declaration. And so I think you've seen lots of calls for certain treatment of immigrants and refugees and other groups that have been rooted in, um, Christian rhetoric, and maybe that's in, you mentioned 10 years. Maybe those calls have become more pronounced over the past several years, to the point that no one can, or very few people can plausibly object to what Vance said by saying, "Oh, why are we talking about Christian concepts?" Because lots of people across the political spectrum have been talking about Christian concepts and appealing to different Christian concepts in support of their, various policy preferences and goals. And so this rhetoric is still, it's with us, and so you can't just dismiss it on those grounds. Yeah, Paul.
I mean, wouldn't a more traditional American perspective be something like, there is no expectation for the state to behave philanthropically, which is precisely why privately, as a private individual, private citizen, I'm perfectly within my rights, even encouraged to develop philanthropies or charities to pursue these aims that are perhaps more in keeping with the more, let's say, demanding or challenging interpretation of the parable that we're discussing. So if you're a private citizen, you can create a charity to help immigrants or pursue these ends, and that would be perfectly compatible with what JD Vance is saying, in some sense. What do you guys think about that?
There are a couple of things that come to mind as possible responses. One is, again, I think some people are going to say that these policies are not just ceasing or ending the state behaving philanthropically, but it's actually the state actively harming people. And so I think some people sort of reject that framing entirely. Um, Another question, and particularly with regards to immigration, the other question that I actually find a little more interesting is to ask whether past, say, if the state has been behaving philanthropically, going above and beyond, and the like, whether past displays of charity or philanthropy can actually generate some sort of continued obligation, or at least obligation to like end those programs or end that charity in a predictable fashion, or the like. I think back to I was in graduate school, and my wife's grandmother very generously sent me a check for $50 a month to help buy books, which on a grad student stipend with a young family like it was a really nice thing to be able to purchase a book or two on Amazon every month and not be thinking like which part of the rent or food budget it was coming from. And she had no obligation to do that. But it would have been really sort of frustrating on my part. I don't know if it would have been wrong for her, but it would have been really frustrating to just like be notified that 2 days before I was expecting the next check to arrive after she'd been sending checks for 3 or 4 years. Oh, by the way, there's no more checks. This is a sort of a trivial example, but I do think there's many ways in which continued behavior or ongoing behavior, even if it's like maybe supererogatory, it's more than what we're sort of demanded of us on the basic level, might carry with it some obligation to, at least when we cease those things, to do so in a way that doesn't leave people completely adrift. You know, I just keep thinking of the phrase, because I'm teaching con law right now, of reliance interests, and I think there is an argument to be said that, like, if the United States has, say, been funding, is it PEPFAR, that this PEPFAR program that is combating HIV in Africa, that if you're going to stop funding that, even if your take is the United States didn't have to do that, that was awful nice of them to do that, that we should try and, like, if you're going to stop funding it, you should do so with some sort of, sunsetting period, so that people can make other arrangements.
Well, it's worth noting in response to that you can buy Vance's general point about the Ordo Amoris and still disagree with uh, lots of details of how the administration is implementing its policy agenda at the moment. So there's the general conceptual point, the theoretical point, and then there's you know the actual implementation of it. And you might like one and not like the other. But I mean, to your point earlier, Paul, this more traditional American argument, perhaps that it's the private citizen's role to be charitable, not the government's. I mean, this is one reason it's important to pay attention to this translation, as I've been calling it, from the individual context to the political, is that the Samaritan is voluntarily giving his own resources to help out the stranger in need. And what's been going on and what goes on in a political context is, well, I, you know, I'm channeling my Michael Humor here, my a colleague of mine and Paul's here at CU. I don't get a say in what charitable causes the United. I mean, I get a vote, but in practice, it's you pay your taxes. You hardly know where your tax money is going half the time, outside of some bigger buckets. And if you don't like that, you got to suck it up. And so this is important for one reason you might think it's important from a Christian context is that there's actually no uh, the virtue of love is not being exemplified by me if my resources are being coercively taken from me to help someone in need, even if they should be. It's a totally different kind of interaction that's going on between me and the person in need. And then there's empirical questions people have raised whether higher taxes and more government entitlement and welfare and so on programs, whether those crowd out the private giving and decrease the amount of private giving that would otherwise occur. That's an interesting question, but that's just one dimension of one way in which you might think that the political and the individual contexts differ, and I'm sure we can think of others as well.
Can we come back to the question of why are we talking about parables from the New Testament as a guide to public policy? Again, because I think this is in some ways, this is a equally strong traditional American response to this whole conversation. And you said something a minute ago, Joe, about maybe reasons that the conversation might be different now than it's been at different times in the past. And I do think it's interesting that in the last several decades, I think George W. Bush and Joe Biden were probably two of the most regular church attending presidents in decades, if not over a century of U.S. history. And Biden in his inauguration speech actually talked about Augustine. There was a debate then about whether his use of Augustine was sort of on track. But I remember he said, that a nation is constituted by a people ordered around its common loves, and so for whatever reason, we're sort of in a moment where public figures, I think, are feeling a little more justified and or a little more free to cite religious concepts or religious beliefs to justify public policy. But those in philosophy will be sort of familiar with this argument from John Rawls about public reason that suggests that, if you're trying to make public policy, you have a obligation to appeal to reasons that are publicly accessible. That is, reasons that people who don't share your religion, for instance, will find as compelling reasons. And again, that's something that we maybe we could talk about that concept. But it is interesting, again, to me that the point Vance is making, it seems that he could have made it in a way that maybe counted as a public reason sort of argument, or at least appealed to. Said this is common sense. Look at how you make the decisions in your own life. But he explicitly says there's this idea in Christianity, and I imagine the ghost of John Rawls standing up and saying "Why are you talking about the Ordo Amoris, JD?" But I'm curious just what you think about maybe that idea of public reason. Is it a problem when someone like JD Vance appeals to specifically religious concepts to just as potential justifications for the public policies he supports. Um, is that something we should be suspicious of, or question, or push him more on, or is it just okay?
I mean, one thing that John Locke would want to know is, did Vance make these remarks in his position as magistrate or as citizen? Because that would bear on how we should think about this appeal. Uh, Go ahead.
Well, as a citizen, I haven't been invited to talk about immigration on Fox News much recently, and so I imagine it's in his position as magistrate.
Okay.
Check your spam folder. There might be an email in there. Well, I mean, I think there's a boring answer to your question, Matt, and then there's a more maybe more interesting. I mean, the boring answer, when he followed up and replied to some of his critics, he did appeal to common sense, and I think what he had in mind. My guess is he would agree with this. So this is a Christian concept, but it's also a common sense concept. It's something, it's not a Christian concept that's exclusively Christian, like the concept of the Trinity or something like that. And so the fact that it's a Christian concept doesn't preclude its being something that a Rawlsian could get behind. But maybe the more interesting, I'm curious to hear your thoughts, both of you, on this. Is I wonder whether we're dealing with and continue to deal with what we've been dealing with in this country since its founding, just competing visions of what America is. And there's this very common sense, uh, pragmatic strand to what Vance is saying, which is, look, you have a government, it's there to take care of its citizens first and foremost. And, the point of the government of Sri Lanka is to take care of Sri Lankans. And the point of the government of, Botswana is to take care of Botswanans, and so on. And that's one familiar way of thinking about politics that resonates with a lot of people. But here in the US of A, for a while now, people have been thinking of this American experiment as, well, this is the city on a hill. And, American exceptionalism and manifest destiny, these ideas that America has this special place in the world and in world history. And I think the city on a hill, that might be secularized, but the religious, and I'll add this for my friend Matt, the scatological dimension of that kind of vision of what the American experiment is, I think does remain with a lot of people. This sense that America should be special, that America is not really just for, or even primarily for, American citizens, but that it is for the world in some sense. I think that's a powerful strand in American political thought that's manifested in lots of ways.
First, I just want to push back on the idea that just because Vance was invited to Fox News, that they expect that he speak in a capacity that Locke would recognize as the capacity of the magistrate. I'm not sure that follows. So let's just set that aside. The second thing is, uh, it might be a powerful strand, and no doubt it is, Joseph, what you're articulating. But if you ask Jefferson, what matters is the consent given by parties willing to compromise. And so whatever these competing visions are, the fact is that no one has become salient or supreme. And it's the consent that matters. It's the consent that holds the structure together.
when it comes to competing visions about of what America is, I think that's one possible really strong explanation for some of the disagreement here, because you do sort of see this implication or this line, that like you said, Sri Lanka is for Sri Lankans, and America is for Americans, or whatever. That the United States is just another nation that's supposed to be prioritizing the people that belong to the nation. But there's one critical perspective, which is to say the United States is not just another nation. It's been for at least 80 years an empire. And as it's been ruling as an empire, it turns out that empires aren't just for the people who live in the imperial core. They kind of have a set of various legal and security obligations to all the various little constituent parts of that empire. And to that point, Sri Lanka doesn't have military bases all over the world, and Sri Lanka doesn't have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, and Sri Lanka doesn't throw its weight around in determining global affairs the same way that the United States does. And so you could see that response, and perhaps the Trump administration is saying, like, yes, that's what we have been, but it's time to move into a multipolar world, or to sort of slowly wind down the era of American empire.
But even if you still conceive of America as an empire, or let's say the federated empire with commitments to client states, that doesn't mean you have to shift gears into a more permissive immigration policy. Right, I would distinguish between those two.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I don't know that particular example. I was thinking more of the foreign aid aspects and of this conversation, I guess, not the immigration aspects.
But I mean,
Well,
your point
okay,
about
go ahead.
empire pertains to the founding too. I mean, America really is an empire of states. It's a federated empire of
Mm-hmm.
states. So there is a sense in which already there's an acceptance of heterogeneity. Um, I would say that's only increased.
Well, in this, I mean, this touches, I think, on your earlier point about Jefferson and consent and compromise. There's, I think, a really important question, right? Uh, how much heterogeneity can there be before we're just past the point of compromising and consenting and working together? And this is I mean, there's a certain amount of toleration that's going to be inevitable. We're not inevitably necessary. We're not all going to agree on literally everything. But I think one of the big questions in American politics now is, well, what's the glue holding this together? What's the glue holding these hundreds of millions of people together? And it's not clear to me what the answer to that question is. And just in terms of empire, I think there is a sense of a shift to a multipolar world. But really, I think we're also seeing competing visions of empire. And on the one hand, a vision of empire that thinks of the empire as for the sake, making the world safe for democracy. So what's the empire for? It's to bring about a certain kind of political vision across the world. And perhaps the more America first vision is, well, no, the point of the empire is better to secure the citizens' interests. And so, yeah, we're looking into the Panama Canal, and we're looking into Greenland, and we're renaming the Gulf of Mexico. But we're doing all these things, not so that there can be democracy and gay rights and whatever else in Greenland or Panama, but to advance the American people's interests by advancing the American government's geopolitical interests. And obviously, you can disagree with all sorts of that, but I think that's one kind of vision that is out there of the empire. I don't think there's a strong political contingent that's genuinely anti-imperialistic. And this, I mean, another hot take to bring it back to the Bible in this context. There's a big part of me that 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 buys the thought, given the radicalness of Jesus' vision in certain ways, and given the realities of wielding political power, not just in the 21st century, but across time, are followers of Jesus really supposed to be the ones who are running the hundreds of military bases and who are trying to implement some imperialistic vision or other? Can they avoid lying? Can they avoid harming anyone? Through
Yeah.
I think there's some interesting questions there. There, of course, that's a big can of worms, but I think that's another question. Is maybe you can't run a country well if you run it on a certain interpretation of the parable of the Good Samaritan, or some of let alone the Sermon on the Mount. And so this is where you get this kind of, these are two different domains, kind of a perspective.
I just have to say you left out Canada, which my students were deeply amused to learn for the first time when they read the Articles of Confederation that there's been a long American dream of welcoming Canada as a state.
Huh.
And I apologize to Paul, who is himself Canadian, for that oversight on my part. Yeah.
Y'all had your opportunity in 1781 when the Articles of Confederation were ratified, and you had that nice pre-approval letter.
That's funny. Yeah, well, I think there's 30% at least of Canadians whose ears perked up and became very interested in the idea. But maybe that's for a different podcast.
And on the other hand, there are maybe 20 or 30% of Americans who would love to see their vision for America is basically to become more like Trudeau's Canada.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think your question about what's holding the American state, regime, people, the substrate together is a very, very interesting question. I think, I'd be curious to hear you guys, offer some thought on this. Like maybe just starting with the minimum. It seems like it has to be some kind of commitment to the principles of citizenship, or the some vision of consent as articulated in the Declaration. But I wouldn't want to stop there. I'm just curious, like how you picture this minimally and then maximally. Um, what are you guys thinking about this question? Because I think it is a very pressing one.
It's sort of like, what's the Apostles' Creed of Americanism, right? Like what is the minimal commitment? I think you're right. There's some affirmation, I think, of the idea of government by and for the people, self-government as worked out through a principle of consent, maybe not a purely Lockean one, and as many threads in the American founding, but and in American history, but um, some some combination of that government by and for the people and self government and commitment to the natural rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To me, that seems like it pretty close to the minimalistic American creed.
Well, I guess my question is, should we think of the glue as creedal, primarily or even exclusively? So, and this is one of the I think one of the other big things that's coming out of this current political moment, right? Is some pushback on the idea that, well, America is just an idea, and we can all come here and just as long. And I think part of the pushback is, let's be realistic about why people are coming here. They're not coming here because they love John Locke and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. That's not why they're coming here. And that's not a criticism of them. That's just a fact. They're by and large coming for economic opportunity. My maternal ancestors who came here from Sicily and Apulia didn't come here because they read Montesquieu and then read the Articles of Confederation and then read the Constitution and thought, these guys are onto something. That's not why they came. And so that's, I think, an important point for us to keep in mind. And I think another thought is, well, is it enough for people to buy government, by the people, for the people, some of these basic ideas that are central to American political thought, or does there need to be some kind of a richer love of this country and its history and its culture and the Super Bowl and whatever else you want to throw in there? Do you have people in this country who, if there's a major war that breaks out, will lie about being underaged so that they can enlist in the army and fight and defend this country? Because that's what you had in many cases 2 or 3 generations ago with World War II. And I think there's a fair question as well. Do you have people who love the country enough that if push comes to shove, they will be willing to do that kind of thing in defense of it? And if you don't, then I think that's fine until the next crisis. So I think that's not super well articulated, maybe, but there's some important questions here. I think about what kind of glue do you need on a practical level to keep
Mm-hmm.
a polity unified and thriving and able to overcome the serious obstacles that come its way. And we haven't faced the kinds of serious obstacles and challenges um, that other countries have had to face in recent decades in terms of outright war on our soil, those kinds of problems. But that doesn't mean we'll never face them again or that other serious challenges won't arise.
Well, and maybe some of those affections you're talking about, or the like, maybe this brings us full circle back to Burke. Maybe many of those affections were historically more closely rooted in local culture, in your state, rather than in the United States, as Paul said, as a federated empire of states, in various forms of civic association, your religious communities, etc. And as many of those other things have declined in importance and declined in influence in the American life, uh, we're increasingly sort of rootless and increasingly untethered. And maybe the United States, maybe the United States has always been a fairly loose set of associations that bound together an awful lot of very thick associations. and as those thicker associations decline, it might be difficult to muster up that same sense of belonging at the national level.
Well, on that cheerful note, there's a lot we could keep saying, but for the sake of time, that's I think a good wrapping up point. I want to thank Paul and Matt. It was a privilege and a pleasure to have you both on. Hope we can do this or something like this again soon. For our listeners and viewers, do you have an X account or anything similar like that that you would like to share with them? Anything along those lines? A great book you've been reading just before we close out?
Oh, a great book. I, Matt, you want to go?
Sure. Um, I'm teaching my intro to political theory students, and we just finished reading Sophocles' play Antigone, and I teach it every semester, oftentimes multiple class sections every semester, and every semester I come away even more deeply fond of that play. I've read it dozens of times now, and um, really can't recommend it highly enough, especially if you're thinking about questions of love and obligation and affection and public policy.
Those same themes feature in Plato's Laws, and I just uh, finished teaching parts of Plato's Laws. It takes them up in a different way, but I had a similar experience going back to the Laws. It's such an impressive text, and I can't recommend it highly enough, especially if you know something about Plato's Republic.
Well, those are some excellent recommendations. Thank you both again. I'm Joseph Porter, and this is the Free Mind Podcast.